Last week, we began our conversation with Mitali Perkins and Samuel Parker about how stories help us reinforce or cross borders. We learned about all kinds of things, about cultural fluidity and transformative style and scope of storytelling. We talked about going to town and going on a journey, and we learned how to pronounce Kolkata. Join us now for the conclusion of that conversation. Samuel, when people cross borders, how do they decide which traditions they're going to uphold and which ones they're going to leave behind them?
I think that's something that is an individual choice and happens in varying degrees. I think you can also ask that, what traditions are they expected to uphold and which ones are they supposed to leave behind by the border that they're crossing into? I think it's a lot of the contention that we see today in that argument. And then you also got to put in the dynamic, like if you are crossing a border, do you expect yourself to stay how you are? And if so, why are you crossing that border then? The level of assimilation, the level of how much of your former self do you keep intact kind of reflects that decision to even make that first step. That is a hard question. I'm trying to land my answer, but it's a really hard question because people are transformed as they move. So I've seen people keep so much of the tradition that they are in effect in a neighborhood isolate themselves or are isolated by others around them because they want to keep so much of that culture and traditions that they've had, which is a good thing. I'm not qualifying any of these actions, but I think it's an individual decision, and I can't categorically say this is how much they should leave behind. I didn't answer your question at all. I realize that.
Sometimes, though, Samuel, a vague answer is an answer. As you were saying, it's, we talk about how you can assimilate into a culture, what you do take, what you don't take. What about you, Mitali?
It's really about the heart, isn't it? I mean, I feel like, as you mentioned, I think Samuel mentioned intention, and it's all about what's going on in the heart. Why are you going to cross that border? Why? What do you want out of it? And so a person who's coming, let's say, from the south to the north, across that Mexican border, is going to come for different reasons than maybe the character in your story, Samuel, which I can't wait to read, by the way. But I think a lot of it's always what's closest to our heart. So whether you're a person of privilege or a person of who lacks privilege, and if you're there for selfish reasons, or there's a lack of humility or dependence on your own capacity, or a lack of gratitude, those deep parts of our heart, that's what I think will define how much you lose and how much you gain and what kind of person you become, is what's going on the heart level.
That's an excellent answer. And you've kind of segued into our next question. And one of the things that I observed, I've been to Greece and worked with refugees from Syria and some of the other areas, Iraq and Iran. And it was very interesting because there has been a noticeable difference in some of the humanitarian organizations that are over there and in some of the national organizations about those who left their country earlier on in conflict and those that are leaving later. And so, Mitali, when you think about crossing a border as a person of privilege, how is that different from crossing a border of a person in desperate circumstances? I know what I learned in my experience, but I'd love to hear from you.
Well, again, I think you can cross the border poorly in both directions because it is a matter of the heart. But there is a reason why Jesus talked about the poor almost having an advantage, because there's no worship of capacity, there's no worship of power. So what happens is we use our privilege as a buffer against transformation, because transformation is scary, it's dangerous, and it hurts. And so the temptation of the person of privilege would be to, I know Holland, you mentioned international schools. I've been in international communities, and you see the people that kind of hide in their little international communities, and they're there's nothing wrong with that because it's scary. It's scary to be transferred, but you can do that when you have access to your international schools and clubs and people that are like you, your own nationality. And that would mean that you would miss out on something deeper, on something more transformational because you're protecting yourself with your privilege from what maybe God is trying to do in your life. So I would say that you can be equally sinful, to use that old word, that beautiful word, you can be equally wrong in either direction. You can be greedy, you can be selfish, you can have ingratitude. That's the human condition. But it is a little easier to see those things when you're not hiding behind wealth and power and privilege and all your own capacity to hide. So that's what I would say.
I can totally appreciate that and absolutely agree with you on that idea of human condition. What about you, Samuel?
I don't think I could add anything to that answer. In fact, I would love to give my time over to Vitaly to continue because she nailed it. I think, crossing a border, either metaphorically or in real life, is, the transformation that happens on one level would come out of necessity. And if you don't have that necessity, then the transformation has to be a deliberate act, and it's very fearful to do that. So I would just, second and reaffirm what Natalia was saying because she said it so brilliantly.
Can I give an example? May I give an example?
Yes,
okay.
Go. Give an example.
All right. Well, when I was I lived 3 years in Guatemala, and during the week I taught at middle school. 9/10 of the people there were Guatemalans, but they were professional class and wealthier Guatemalan folks. And then on Saturdays, I taught at a university in town. And that was, in some cases, the whole family pitched in to pay for one member to go to school. Or I think in some cases, all the neighbors pitched in for one person to be able to attend class. And people were more blue-collar jobs hoping to get into white-collar work, or they were hoping to sort of help their family move up just a little bit economically. And the cultural difference between the Guatemalan people I was with all week and the Guatemalan people I was with all weekend was significant, just because of their economic differences and their experiences. If you asked, what did you do over break during the week, you'd get anything from, we spent the week at my farm, which was like a plantation, to we went to Euro Disney. If you asked that on the weekends, you'd get a sort of a blank stare. What's a vacation? Or you'd get, I worked. It was just a whole different experience. And yet both were in the same city, in the same place. People spoke the same language, and they all had the same passport.
Well, I really appreciate your answer, both of you, Samuel, Vitaly, and Vitaly, this idea of privilege being a buffer to transformation. And that when I think about any border stories, whether you're talking about all sorts of different borders, privilege comes in a lot of different viewpoints. So let's think about the different facets of where privilege might come from when you're crossing borders.
Let's think about faith or age or worldview. I mean, we bump up against people who are very different from us all the time. So how can border crossing stories help us relate to people who are different from us, even if they live down the street and have very similar cultural backgrounds? What do you think, Samuel?
Well, I think they're imperative right now. I think with the ability to silo yourself, as Natalia said earlier, in communities of like-mindedness, and it's a like-mindedness of whatever piece you want, like-mindedness of faith or an age community or an economic community. It's so easy now to do that, and I think we're seeing the ramifications of that kind of growing exponentially every year. Us and them groups based on whatever piece you want to found a group on seems to be happening. I think the need for these stories is growing more and more. The problem is getting people to read these stories and to challenge them to say, look, the neighbor down the street who's wearing the hijab, or the person who just moved in who's from Vietnam is here and functioning in this world very much like you are. they're not that different in a sense, and you have to have the discipline to educate yourself, to study, to read, and to actually just open the door and walk over and say hello. I think, again, these stories are so helpful right now, needed, important, to just try to get that first step for a person to cross that border.
Mitali, what do you think?
Well, I have the advantage of writing for kids. I'm a big believer that grown-ups are overrated. Partly because kids are so, like I said before, I discovered my own ability to it's called code switching. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's this idea that you can learn a cultural code really quickly. And when you're doing it as a kid, kids can pick up languages faster. Their accents change quicker. They learn how to be polite in a culture 10 times faster than a grown-up. And so I think they're much more willing to cross borders to read as well, because they're not looking and saying, does this kid go to the same schools that I did? They're thinking, hey, this is a kid. It's a kid who crashes her dad's rickshaw. That's exciting. Let me find out. And they're very open to crossing borders in fiction. Poor Samuel's stuck with grown-ups. I'm sorry for that, because grown-ups get really rigid when it comes to reading, and that's too bad. But I love getting the letters from kids about when my books are fully set in India or in another culture, and they have no American characters. You know, that bridge character, that idea that you need a Julia Roberts figure to take you overseas because American readers won't go. Well, kids really don't need that bridge character. I get letters from rural Iowa for kids that say, I loved your book, Secret Keeper, because, well, the annoying aunt is just like my annoying aunt. And it's set in the 1970s India with no American characters. So I love writing for kids because they have that great ability they're not wrecked yet when it comes to that cultural rigidity that sets in. I'd say about 17 or 18 years old, you lose that cultural fluidity. You lose the code switching capacity that we're all really given. We're given and that's why maybe Jesus said, be like children. It is a spiritual call. It's a really deep call to formation that we miss out on if we are just surrounding ourselves with stories and people who are just like us. It's a loss for us.
I want to just continue this little conversation. This part of the conversation is, I think you're totally right, Mitali. I see my sons when the books that they're reading and checking out from the library. They're 12 years old, and you're absolutely right. They just want that story. They want to say what other kids are doing, the experience the kids are having. Where in the adult world, it seems like people are saying, okay, what's your agenda in this, what's your political stance in this storyline? It's like, you can't, I'm trying, first of all, to tell a story that's compelling. I do write in the suspense thriller genre, so it has to be hopefully exciting, right? But I'm not trying to reinforce a political ideology on border control or border crossings, where I see my sons just saying, tell me a great story. Tell me a good story. And, it can be a kid from anywhere, and they embrace it and they love it and they talk about it. And it is sad that that's lost somewhere as we all grow up.
Appreciate that, Samuel. And, that kind of leads us a little bit into this idea. We opened our episode last week with the idea of hope and having hope. And so I don't want to give up on adults and not believe that we can't ever have a hope for change, because we do have the possibility of a transformation. You all spoke about that, how good stories help the reader escape and create some transformation. And so, Mitali, as we think about ideas for teachers and parents, because these are the adults, when we talk about who are those librarians who are going to put books in hand, who are those teachers who are going to help support that mindset shift, what are some ideas that teachers or parents can use to help their kids talk about these different cultures and crossing borders?
Well, I think like Samuel was saying, let your kids lead you into the great, rich, diverse world of fiction we have right now. There are amazing stories being told. So I would say let your kids lead you, go to your libraries. I was a feral reader. I didn't have any parent or adult leading me into, my mom would just drop me off at the library and I would browse like a wild reader, finding my own story. And that's really the amazing thing about stories is, people have said they're like windows and mirrors, and you can never, especially with kids who read more with their hearts than their heads, you can never anticipate what that child is going to say. That's just like me. What mirrors are they going to find? And so I would say one word of advice would be, if you have little kids, you can use windows and mirrors both to introduce a book. So, for example, you could say, hey, this is a book about Bangladesh or Burma. Let's learn about another country. Or you could use the mirror approach, which is, this is a book about a boy who really wants to help his mom, just like you want to help your mom. And you see how that's a mirror approach to the story?
Absolutely.
So I would say that works all the way up through about 4th to 5th grade. But then I would begin to emphasize more of the mirror aspect and de-emphasize, even though it's a book, say, about a Mexican kid or a Guatemalan kid, I would not approach my child at that older, like, say, around the age of Samuel's boys, where you would say, oh, this is a book that will help you grow in geography and history, and you'll learn about other cultures. It'll be a window book for you. I would say this is a great adventure story about a boy who really wants to save a tiger cub because the tiger cub's being chased by bad guys. That's something you would do because you love animals. So I would approach it very much as a mirror book when I introduce it to that kid, even though it's going to that's what a book is going to do. It's going to take them across that border and take them to the Sundarbans region of India where the book is set. And then again, by the time that a child is about 10th grade or above, an adult, you could use both windows and mirrors again. But there's that in between, I'd say 4th to about 10th grade, where you want to introduce even the most exotic of books to your own family culture with that mirror approach first, which will intrigue the child. That would be my one tip.
That's awesome, because I heard, Samuel, you say, we really just need a good story. I think as any of us as readers and writers, the character development, the story, the plot line, the arc, those are so critical. Anything you can add to that, Samuel?
Yeah, I don't want to presume that I can tell teachers how to teach at all. But one thing, listening to Natalia talk, was I think one aspect that you want to foster in kids, and we try to foster at home, is that really no question is off limits. We live in a culture now that seems to be highly attuned to causing offense and the worry about causing offense. And kids are going to ask questions that are incredibly offensive, because they don't know. But if they're learning about other cultures or other people, they're going to ask questions that, as we get older, we're like, you don't ask that question. But they're coming because they want to learn, and they're curious, and they want understanding. And that's one thing I wish that we could translate into the adult world again a little bit, is that it's okay to ask questions. When I was writing my book, Border Son, I had the luck of having really good friends, Mexican-American friends down living in San Antonio area and even further south Texas. And they gave me the luxury of asking any question, knowing who I am and knowing what my intentions were. I didn't have to worry about, that's a sensitive question, I shouldn't ask that. Because I knew I was trying to understand, and I was trying to educate myself and trying to grow and just trying to fully get a full grasp of a different culture. You have to find a space to do that, and you have to have relationships around you that allow you to do that. I think kids are lucky that they have that environment to ask those questions.
So, Mitali, I know you teach a class on race, culture, and power in kids' books. Can you give us that class in 30 seconds? What are things to watch out for when interacting with race and power?
The grading is the worst part. I actually taken a hiatus from that this year because the grading, I hated the grading. Everybody gets an A. That's how I like to grade. So the idea, I have some stuff I could share with you on my website, questions that I like to ask about race, culture, and power when I'm writing. Like, for example, how is race described? Are you using a descriptor word like African American or Mexican American? And if so, the words change so fast, right, in the culture. So you're gonna, and if you're using that for your people of color and you're not using that for your people who are white, then there's an imbalance. So race descriptors, you want to take a close look and see how you're describing it. If you're not using them, is there a white default going on? So there's lots of questions we want to ask ourselves as writers. Things like, are we using a trope? Is there a sort of magical oriental figure that has a backstory that gets thrown in the story to solve the problem? And that's a very common sort of trope that is in America, kind of elder figure of color that comes in and saves the day. And then the issues of who is saving the day. Is it the outsider? Is it the insider? Who's actually got the power to make the change, to be changed, to have not just be a foil, but to actually have a backstory? There's a lot of questions that you want to explore as you're writing and reading. And I have a lot of stuff in my blog that I've written over the years that I can share with you, and you can maybe post. They're really important questions because something is being communicated under the waterline of the story. And it's no accident that when Jesus came, could have done a lot of things this time, but he ended up telling a lot of stories for 3 years. Because there's this power of the story that goes under the waterline of our minds into our very hearts. And sometimes those could be not big messages. So we really want to explore what's happening under the waterline of the stories we tell and the stories that we receive. And that involves asking those questions, as Samuel said, being free to ask those questions.
So last question, what's a metaphor, Samuel, to help us understand border crossing stories?
Yeah. You stumped me.
Samuel, we give you all the tough questions. You got the harder questions. I have.
But you do have the more eloquent answers. So.
Yeah. Well, we're coming back at you, Tally. So you better be thinking of your metaphor too.
Oh my goodness, yeah. That is a hard one. A good metaphor for crossing borders. You stumped me. I'm sorry. I'm not contributing to your podcast right now.
You just contributed a whole lot.
But Tally, help.
I'll go first, and then you can think while I'm talking. I don't look no further than the beautiful stories in the Gospels. We have beautiful metaphors of being a neighbor. We have just that beautiful drink of water that Jesus is able to ask from a woman who lacked power. He asks from her. And there are these ideas of setting a table and hospitality and the bread and the wine that we provide to the alien and the stranger. And there's just these beautiful, incredible metaphors that are rich and deep and really sustain us. It's a life's journey that we're called to welcome the alien and the stranger. That's, as I said before, it's really a non-negotiable for the spiritual life. If I lean into the setting a table, being a neighbor, really, and that true relationship that happens in that scene, that beautiful story of the woman at the well where she's actually thirsty and asks her for help. And then they have this incredible conversation that is so give and take. So I would look no further than those old resources for our metaphors.
That's wonderful. I really appreciate that. We talk about, from our very first episode, we've kind of captured a little phrase, you are welcome at our table, and appreciate that. We want to have that open door. Did that jog any thoughts for you, Samuel?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. You took all the good ones. Okay, let's stretch. I'll try to see if this is relevant. But for crossing borders, the merging of two different identities, right, is like jazz, all right, where there's an underlying rhythm that is known by all the performers, which is the common humanity that we all share, right? But everybody's allowed to riff on the common theme. If you listen to good jazz, and perhaps border crossing is like that, where you merge the common, and then everybody's allowed to riff, within a frame of culture, to create something even improvised and spontaneous.
For somebody who was a little tongue-tied on a metaphor, I am absolutely getting a beautiful picture about this idea of crossing borders with the jazz and with the idea of coming to the table. And we really appreciate that. And so as we think about this whole theme of this episode of Crossing Borders, universal stories help us understand when to respect boundaries, how we can develop relationships. They give us the power to cross emotional, national borders and allow us to empathize with those on all sides and not just focus on a single story.
Thank you, Mitali and Samuel, for a powerful conversation. Next week, we'll be talking with Nick Riddle and Jennifer St. Charles, two accomplished musicians, about the impact of lyrics in music. And don't forget to subscribe to the AfterwordPodcast.com, like us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, and see you next week. You are welcome to join the conversation at our table where the librarians and the teachers and the writers and readers and all the cool kids sit.